When I was growing up, my mother told me, son, you were born with one mouth and two ears. Does that tell you anything? So I listen a lot. And I'm blessed with good relatives, good children, good grandchildren, and a son-in-law. And I'll tell you why. My daughter is in Virginia. She is the International Trade Director for the Virginia Economic Development Partnership. So she keeps me informed about what's going on with exports. Probably you didn't know that Virginia exports more product than we import. One of the biggest exports from the state of Virginia to Russia is vodka. Bourbons, because it's cheap. Second of all, my son-in-law is an engineer with Great Lakes Dredge and Dock Company. He is really a smart kid. He has been to the Panama Canal to help them do some turning bases down there. He was at the Suez Canal when Great Lakes was finishing up. But the absolute smartest thing he did was marry my daughter, and he loves my two grandchildren. You know, I really hate to be last on a program, especially after following two great speakers like, and I need these, two great presenters like Bobby and Cyril. So just to give us a break in the action, I'm going to relate a couple of funny stories that you all will be able to relate to, being sailing people. I was outbound on a nice summer sunny day in July off Norfolk International Terminals in a Swedish-American line cargo ship. Course was 357, being sailors you all know that. Speed was about 7 to 8 knots, and I noticed the sailboat coming across the anchorage, and he was on a broad reach, had the wind under his stern, and I kept looking, and I figured, well, if he keeps coming, we're going to be pretty close together. So I kept going, and then I said, okay, so I sounded him one whistle to let him know I was planning on holding my course and speed, but that didn't do any good. He just kept right on coming. So I stopped the engine, and I kept looking when he was about a half a mile away, I kept blowing the whistle, and he just kept coming right across. And lo and behold, he hit my vessel right on the port side.
Yeah, we did. Was he awake?
Right in the middle, and of course we were just about to stop. So he fell around alongside. I walked out on the port wing there, and I was looking down, and I saw two scantily clad bodies pop out of the cabin. I'm standing there looking, and the only thing I heard was, "We're all right. Don't call the Coast Guard, and especially don't call my wife." Another true story. Just before I retired, I went to sail a container vessel out of the Portsmouth Marine Terminal, a small ship, the city of Liverpool. And I arrived at the ship about 11:30 for a midnight sailing. All the cranes were up, everything was quiet. So I walked on board the ship, walked right up to the wheelhouse. Nobody in sight, so I went over to the kettle, turned it on, filled it full of water to make some coffee. A few minutes later, a gentleman comes up. He's dressed in a black leather jacket and black leather pants. So when he gets up on the wheelhouse level, I said, "Good evening, sir. My name is George Watkins. I'm your pilot." He didn't say one word. He walked right across the wheelhouse and looked out into the night. So finally he turned around and he says, "Are you the pilot?" I said, "Yes, sir, I'm the pilot." He said, "Well, I'm the captain." And he said, "You know, I don't believe I've ever seen you before." And I said, "Well, Captain, it's a very, very simple explanation for this." I said, "This ship is so small that it's handled by apprentices. And all of them are busy tonight. And when the order was filled, my name was at the top of the list, so here I am." He turned around and looked at me. He says, "My Jove, I'm glad you explained that to me. What all that gray hair? I thought you were a slow learner." So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, members, guests of the Old Point Kilford Yacht Club, and thanks for having me, Bob, and that kind introduction. Just before I left home this morning, I always tell my wife, Mary Jo, of some 55 years, where I'm going, who I'm addressing, and what I plan to speak about. Going out the door, as usual, she said, "Let me tell you something. You're going to be speaking to some fairly intelligent people, so I would suggest you speak about 10 minutes and sit down." But you know, mariners speak an unusual language, and most of our terminology comes from our experiences aboard ships. No matter to what port you sail, the language of pilotage is universally accepted and the same. And beyond the language comes the pilot's inner view of his world and responsibilities. In fact, if you were to watch the pilots ply their trade in the ports of Virginia, most of what we do cannot be put down in words. We just do it. You know, each pilot has his own unique way of performing his duties, and it's just, as this gentleman from MSC knows, I mean, it's indicative of pilots all over the world. We just do our thing. But even in the presence of modern day electronics, when a pilot shakes hands with a ship's captain and that captain turns over the command of his ship, it's a repetition of a time-honored custom in history filled with tradition. The earliest charter of the organized pilots were the Trinitaries pilots in England, and they were founded in about 1369. And in 1604, King James I granted compulsory pilotage to its members, and this set a pattern eventually for the royal government of Virginia to foster its system of pilotage. One of the greatest strengths of the pilotage or apprenticeship system is, of course, its time-honored policy of policing its own. Obviously, no such knowledgeable maritime experts were available in 1607 when Captain Christopher Newport, after crossing the Atlantic, bound for Jamestown, showed up off the Virginia coast with his three little ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery. After planning a cross on the beach at Cape Henry, which some regard as the first Thanksgiving Day, Captain Newport, it took him 3 additional weeks feeling his way up the James River before he reached his destination of Jamestown. However, on subsequent voyages of supply to the Jamestown colony, local mariners became available to undertake piloting them to safety, and it's been so ever since. By the year 1609, Virginia colonists at Jamestown had expanded to 3 additional colonies, 3 additional plantations, excuse me. One group of about 150 people began a plantation at the falls of the James River, the present-day site of our state capital, Richmond. Another offshoot of nearly the same size moved to the Nansemond River in today's Suffolk. The name Nansemond means fishing point, and the Nansemond tribe was one of the largest in Virginia. A 4th group of 60 souls resided right here at Old Point Comfort. They fared much better than the other groups due to a better food management program and an ample amount of seafood, which made a quiet relationship with the Indians. One of the people living on Old Point Comfort was pilot John Clark. And in June of 1611, Clark was summoned and boarded a Spanish vessel anchored right here near Old Point Comfort to direct her to sea. On his arrival at Cape Henry, with his yawl boat in sight, the master of the ship refused to slack his sails and refused to let pilot Clark disembark. He took him back to Spain, where he was made a prisoner, and he spent several years in a dungeon before the British government could arrange for his release. Clark managed to have another interesting assignment, as he was assigned to be second mate on board the Mayflower. Unfortunately, his ship that was bound to Jamestown was driven off course by bad weather and ended up at Plymouth Rock. Hence was the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The main thing to remember here, though, ladies and gentlemen, is that there was a Virginia pilot on board the Mayflower. In the ensuing years, as the Virginia colonies grew and prospered, and more ports were developed, the tobacco trade took on an increasing importance, and shipping assumed an even greater role in the colonial economy. This meant that the government also assumed an increasing role in regulating the conduct of pilots by setting their fees that they might collect for the services that they provided, and otherwise supervising the trade. To begin with, almost anyone that desired could represent himself as a pilot. By 1661, however, the general dissatisfaction prompted the Virginia House of Burgesses to pass its first Navigation Act. And that created the office of chief pilot, of which Captain William Owen was the first appointee. He in turn was followed by a Captain Chichester, and Captain Chichester was followed by his son William. They were also charged with the training of apprentices. So began the official endorsement of the tradition where sons followed their fathers in the creation of a pilotage dynasty. As early as 1662, merchantmen were petitioning King Charles to regulate the arrival and departure times for ships destined to the Virginia colonies. But because of natural competition between the shipping lines, that was turned down. As late as 1674, the Spanish had several warships in Chesapeake Bay, and during the summer of that year, one was able to overtake the vessel Thomas and Mary of Norfolk, plunder her cargo at that time that was valued at about 6,000 pounds sterling. Today, that cargo would be valued at about $1.6 million. By 1703, the Virginia planters were beginning to realize the riches that awaited them once the gold leaf products reached their markets in Europe. That brought about the request of convoy protection for vessels carrying these precious cargo. That was turned down. Over the next 100 years or so, the pilots were very fragmented and could not get organized for the betterment of the craft. Well, there were pilot groups for each area and the rivers that they serviced. With so many plantations growing tobacco, it was felt that the area should have its own pilot group and provide their own pilot boat. For example, in 1691, Butte Street in Norfolk was considered a pilot town, and Queen Street in Hampton was also considered a pilot town. And the pilots, being somewhat business oriented, they could see what was happening, so they began purchasing acreage along the river, and they were growing the tobacco so that they could export it on the ships that they were piloting. Pretty slick. The routes of the various trading towns were learned and recorded by the early Virginia pilots, but charts for these rivers were shallow on information. The pilots had to continually practice the ancient art of depth finding with the use of the lead line. We know what that is? Okay. This was very guarded information, kept in their own logbooks, as well as all of the title information. And even then, some of the more guarded figures were memorized and passed on to apprentices, as was the custom followed in England. And in really shoal waters, many of the pilots practiced depth recording with a sounding rod, which is still used by the Maryland oarsmen today. By 1662, the government became more involved in regulating the independent-minded colonial pilots. The pilots at that time had to be appointed by the court in the county in which they resided and have at the ready a sufficient pilot boat rigged with at least an 18-foot keel. The biggest problem with this law was that if an inbound vessel, and I'm going back to what Bobby said, if an inbound vessel was sighted, the first pilot boat that got out to the inbound ship normally got the job. But the difference was when the pilot went on board, he presented the master a fresh cut branch from a tree. And that way the master knew that he was a pilot and not a pirate, because he from the sea. And that's how they distinguished the pilots from the pirates. And if I was to mention the name of Edward Teach, I know you all recognize him. You know a pirate by the name of Blackbeard. And he sailed up along the Virginia and Carolina coast, looting and pillaging many vessels today. Now, pilotage goes back to biblical times and was written about in the 27th chapter of Ezekiel, who lived some 6 centuries before Christ. Pilots were also mentioned in the writings of Marco Polo with reference to the Arab pilots. So, ladies and gentlemen, we might very well be the second oldest profession known to man. One of the first acts of the Virginia General Assembly after it convened in Richmond in May of 1783 was to recognize the pilotage system and require each pilot to train and take one apprentice due to the loss of so many pilots during the American Revolutionary War. There were just not enough pilots available to handle the flood of merchantmen coming to Virginia. Change it? Very good. Right on point. Notice the number of pilot boats here around Cape Henry, and especially to look at the mast of the pilot vessel Mary. As previously mentioned, an inbound vessel was sighted and the race was on, and the pilot with the fastest boat normally got the job. And I won't go into them presenting the branch to the master and they recognize as a French pilot. But today's Virginia Pilot Association, the association that I was a member of, was established by legislation of Virginia's General Assembly in 1866 through the efforts of Captain Samuel Wood of Hampton, Virginia. Our first board for branch pilots was established in June of 1866, and here we are some 150 years and some 160 pilots later, with just a few differences. One must ask themselves what lures young men and women into the profession of piloting. Some of them have sailing experiences in small pleasure craft, and some have attended maritime academies. I can honestly say that many of them think they know what they're getting into, but they really don't know all that this profession requires. I always found the piloting part of the job the easiest. The Virginia pilots are certainly well trained in every respect to perform their trade. We know that it takes a 5-year apprenticeship, and that is the best way to train pilots, and we don't shorten it for any of the applicants, even though they might come from a maritime academy. I must point out that about 50% of the people that start the program don't finish. Is it their love of the water, a job that carries a lot of responsibility, the challenge of a job that not everybody can do well? I wish I could tell you their reasons. I can tell you my reason for becoming a pilot. I was a very good small boat sailor on the Elizabeth River, and I knew exactly what I wanted to be on one of the ships transiting that river in any way. I had read many of Mark Twain's books, and a river pilot was never out of my mind. Now, when I started my apprenticeship, we spent most of our time on the large pilot boat around the face of Cape Henry. For the first 6 months, I learned how to get hot coffee for the pilots. I polished the brass in the wheelhouse, stood the watch, and learned the Morse code because at that time there were no radios. And we assisted in the boarding of every ship in the yawl boat. Yes, at times we did ride ships with the senior pilots for experience, and we studied on board the pilot boat in our spare time. Along with boarding ships, we were continually landing men on the beach, most of the time in fresh northerly winds in the yawl boat. It was a harsh reminder that the business of pilotage was a 24/7 operation. It just did not stop. It was a part of the job, and we soon learned that safety on the job wasn't everything, it was the only thing. This is a picture here of the replica of the pilot schooner Virginia. She was the 5th ocean-keeping vessel owned by the Virginia Pilots. She was the last of the sail pilot schooners. She was built in 1930, let me see, her dimensions were 122 feet length overall, and her beam was 24 feet. She went into service in late 1916 and retired from the pilotage service in 1939. She was eventually put back into service as a vessel of the Gloucester fishing fleet, and she went on to win many schooner races between Halifax, Nova Scotia, and Marblehead, Massachusetts. My first tour on the pilot boat lasted 63 days. I got home around noon, My mother said, son, don't even come in the house with that sea bag. You put it right there on the porch and let the smell get away from it. I'll wash your clothes, but you're not bringing them in the house. I had to report back to the pilot office the next morning at 0400. The next tour lasted a little bit less, 40 days. The main dress on the pilot boat at that time were t-shirts, shorts, khaki pants, and a pair of size 13 boots. I know that you're all asking why size 13. Well, if you ever fell overboard, the boots would fill with water and float off, making it easier to swim. And we did have some accidents from time to time. At that time, there was a shortage of pilots, and I was licensed and started piloting ships after just 15 months into the program, which normally took 2 years. Very few vessels in those days had radar equipment. Navigation was done by dead reckoning, using a good watch, standing on the wing of the vessel, listening for the horns and bells on the aids to navigation. Now, gentlemen and ladies, you know, being sailors, that's real grassroots piloting. Let's see what we have. Here we have an overview of the apprenticeship program today, and I can tell you that it's basically the same that we had, but physically it was nowhere near as demanding. It's still a 5-year program. All of the Virginia pilots are required to have 3 licenses. We have a state branch license, which is renewed annually, a federally first-class pilot's license, and an unlimited inland master's license is issued by the Coast Guard, which are renewed every 5 years. Our state branch license is a license that we operate on about 95% of the time. We're the only pilot association, I'm very proud to say this, on the eastern Gulf Coast that requires all of its pilots to have a master's. So let's get to the more interesting part of this talk. If you don't take anything home today but 2 words, I want you to take this home: command and control. Command and control. It's a simple explanation of what a pilot's role is when he boards a vessel to direct her in or at a port. The master is always in command of his vessel. The pilot is there as an advisor to the master. Should a question arise or the pilot does a maneuver that the master doesn't agree with, he can simply tell the pilot to stand down and he will now direct the navigation of the vessel, or he can call for another pilot. When a pilot boards a vessel, maritime law requires that there be a master-pilot exchange of information, which brings each of them up to speed on any conditions that might affect the safe passage of the vessel. Once this exchange has taken place, the master turns over the control of navigation of the vessel to the pilot. It's a tradition that has taken place for centuries. I'm happy to say that in performing some 15,000 pilotages, I never had a master question my actions in handling his vessel and getting her out of port. Here we have one of the 2 early Virginia pilot boats. This one was originally the private yacht of Mr. Hiram P. Bingham. Her name was the Hardy Bayou. She was built in Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in 1925 and served the Virginia pilots from 1932 to 1971. The second one is the ex-Coast Guard cutter Comanche. She was built in 1934 and served the Virginia pilots from 1968 to 1981. These 2 vessels held station and only came in 6 times in 50 years due to rough weather at Cape Henry. I want you to notice this picture in the ice. This is taken in 1973 in Lynnhaven Inlet. You see the little launch coming alongside, been following along. Well, that's because the mothership is clearing the way because the ice would cut into the fiberglass hull. And also notice the ladder hanging there. That's how you boarded from the launch to the pilot boat, from the pilot boat to the launch. And I can tell you it was the most bad weather. It was the most dangerous part of a pilot's job. I don't want to leave you with this cold picture, so let's go to the next one. This is a picture of our annual cruise that we took the maritime community on, normally in June or July, and we'd go down and take a look at various sites in the harbor. Everybody seemed to like it. I'm sure a couple of y'all have been on this cruise. So, here we are. Next one. Here we are getting ready to move ashore. Of course, this is a chart of Cape Henry. This is where we begin our services as pilots. The vessels will come in from the east, maybe down the South Atlantic Seaway and up. And we board in the general area right off Cape Henry. That's the Pilotage area. And I'm happy, well, I don't know whether I'm so happy now, but I can tell you, these charts, and every chart that a pilot uses when he's examined on an original examination, he draws it from memory. So I can tell you, I know where the deep water is, and I know where the deep water isn't. So, let's see. Okay, let's go to the next one. This is our present facility in Lynn Haven Inlet. There, the building to the left is where we have the president's office, the sleeping quarters, the apprentice instruction room. Then we have our repair facility. And the most important piece of equipment on this site is the travel lift to the right. If something's going to happen to one of your boats, it's not going to be on a clear, calm, sunny day, I can assure you. It's going to be in the worst weather you can think of. And it's imperative that you get them in, get them out of the water, and put them back. You notice we figure that it takes 3 of those large pilot boats to keep 2 running. And it's that they are really the backbone of the operation. You've got to have those to operate. So here we go. Next one. This is our radio control tower, located at the base of the new Cape Henry Lighthouse. It allows us to, it's like the air traffic control tower at the airport. And it allows us to talk to ships that are about 75 miles away and start plotting them about 30 miles away. Next shot. And it's imperative that we have a good shot when the ships come in and out, that if the launch doesn't call to say, hey, I put Captain Watkins on the ship, when you see the launch leave the ship, you know that the transfer has been made. So, the next shot. I was going to get Sarah. You all didn't notice, but today's Sarah's birthday. She's 30 years old. So anyway, but I was going to say, well, Captain McCoy, you're up in the second story wheelhouse, second story there, and you're waiting to be called. So the pilot tower calls, okay, Captain McCoy, it's time for you to come down, get the launch, and go to your ship. So you come down to the first floor, grab a newspaper, step from one solid surface there on the dock to another solid surface. It takes a lot of bad situations out of the pilots getting on and off ships. So here we go. There we are. That's fine. That's fine. Here's the pilot launch outbound on a nice summer day. I can tell you it's summer. The wind's out of the southeast, and it's probably pretty warm because I noticed the door is shut, and those guys do not like to waste that air conditioning. So let's try the next slide. And here we are on a little bit rougher day. We have the swell starting to build from the northeast, and the pilot launch is coming out to take a pilot off the ship. And I want to show you this next sequence of 3. Let's go to the first one. This is the swell building up off Cape Henry, easterly swell off Cape Henry. So let's go to the next slide. You can see the pilot boat is not running full speed, probably 12 or 13 knots, and we go to the next slide. So can we back those up to the yeah, very good. The next one, okay, that one. The main thing I want you to remember here, ladies and gentlemen, is that those swells are just as big at nighttime as they are during the day. So safety isn't everything, it's to own it. So here we go up, and we go over. Now this launch is going out to board this vessel in the next shot. That's right off Cape Henry. Every day is not that rough, but this is right at Cape Henry. And what's going to happen? This ship is about 600 feet long, and you're going to notice that she's in a sort of an easterly direction, and the swell is coming in. So what's going to happen is the waves slowly diminish in groups of 6 or 7. The pilot will turn that vessel to the starboard and make a lee on the starboard side to be taken off. So let's go to the next slide, and this shows you the size of that swell. It lifts about that ship right out of the water. And then the next one, you get a nice saltwater bath. But that's what we do every day. You know, it's not that rough every day, but it's just something that takes practice and time. And so the next slide is the pilot launch has made the transfer. He's come back in laying off of Lynn Haven Inlet. And what we do is when the swell starts building up, we sort of surf the pilot boat in. They'll lift the stern, we go full speed, and go up to within about a quarter of a mile of the bridge. Now, let's see. Well, okay, let's go to the next slide. Not every day that we have is rough, but we do have other weather conditions to deal with, and one of them is the fog. Here, the launch is coming up astern of a car carrier, and that launch is about 200 feet away from the ship, and then the next picture, about 100 feet away, and the last picture is about 50 feet away. So we always go around the stern of an inbound ship for safety reasons, because it's hard to get hit when you're coming up astern of them. So when the pilot goes on board the ship, he and the master will have their conference, and they decide whether or not the vessel will proceed into port or wait for the weather to improve. 99% of the time, the vessel proceeds safely into port with the use of the vessel's radar and the pilot's GPS global positioning system. Ships are on a schedule, and they want to keep that schedule, if at all possible. Container vessels today cost between $65,000 and $125,000 a day to operate. They do not make money sitting still. And really, let's face it, in foggy weather and in really bad weather is where the pilot shows his expertise and the real value of his service. What is really expected of the pilot is to get the vessel safely into its berth, if at all possible. Next shot. Here we have two vessels meeting in Thermal Shoal Channel. The vessel to the left is an outbound maximum draft coal vessel. Depth of 50 feet. She had to sail 2 hours before high water at Cape Henry to have the most water underneath the keel. And the inbound ship is an inbound container ship. The horizontal distance between those ships is about 300 feet. So let's go to the next one. Now, from international marine law, limits a pilot's climb to 10 meters. I can tell you from the bottom of this ladder to that platform is 33 feet. So if you've got a fear of heights, I can tell you pilotage is probably not your game. Here we have, next slide, here we have some shots of the pilots boarding the ship there. This pilot, like myself, full-figured boy, I like to step off the top of the wheel. It takes about 10 steps off the climb. The ship is always moving. Next slide. And then you can see the pilot disembarking there. There's always two men on the pilot boat, one operating and one seaman there to help in case the pilot would have some problem. And then, of course, the next slide shows you the Maersk Line vessels. That's the Cadillac of all pilot ladders. They lift you up and they put you down. And yes, we do some naval vessels. John didn't mention it, and Bob didn't mention this. Bob's something I'm very proud of. I was a special pilot for the aircraft crash for 15 years, so I know about them. They're great ships, and I really enjoyed it. But we pilot those ships. They are public vessels. They're not required to take a pilot, but they do. It's at the discretion of the captain. And all of the aircraft carriers, as I said, and most of the submarines do take our pilots. Here we have just come in from sea. We're getting ready to dock at the Naval Operating Base. And then the next morning, we're bound up to the Norfolk Naval Shipyard where she's going to go into the ship. I thought that was a great picture. Really nice. So, let me see. Yeah. And we always board those aircraft carriers by helicopter. They pick us up at the Naval Air Station, and we went out about 20 miles just south and west of the Chesapeake Light Towers. And we do pilot submarines. Some of our pilots call those rascals the black tubes of death. If the weather is 80 degrees or above, you can be very comfortable in a light sweater. If it's any colder than that, they give you a heavy coat to put on because you will need it. And here's part of our continuing education program. These are live scale models which pilots go over. We went to the Wasatch Institute in Southampton, England, and it gave you a real perspective of two vessels meeting in narrow channels, and also two vessels, one overtaking the other in the narrow channels. It was a great learning experience, but I think the main thing that most of the pilots learned was patience. Patience, because I can tell you most of us have so little of it. Let's see, and then the next picture is over in a scale model in Grenoble, France. This was basically the same thing, but they let you dock and undock ships with tugs. And these models were about 50 feet long and about 15 feet wide. And the anchors were about as big as your fist, and the rudder was about as big as your hand. So, it was a real good learning experience. And the instructors that we had over there were ex-North Sea ferry boat pilots, and they were excellent teachers. I really learned a lot from them. So, here we have the Suez Canal operation. What they would do, they would put you, pilot would be standing up, the engineer quartermaster would be down in the hull, and they'd put you in this canal they call the Suez Canal. So they'd let you make a couple of trips through there, get your confidence up. By the time you got halfway through, they'd start another ship around the other way. So it was a matter of pride that, we never hit them head on, but we'd brush the sides once in a while. But it was a matter of pride. I went through that and didn't touch it. So, here we go. The next is the Carnival Cruise Line coming in to Nauticus. Yes, Carnival will make about 10 trips this year, in and out, picking up and discharging passengers. But one of the more important things that they do at Nauticus is they have ships that come in for a courtesy call. They'll come in and discharge. The buses will pick people up, take them to Jamestown, Yorktown, Williamsburg. Most important spot over there is MacArthur Mall to the shopping mall. So here we go. Next. This is a roll-on, roll-off container vessel. We all know what that is, That's the Atlantic Companion. And just before Portsmouth Marine Terminal closed, this vessel carried, think about this now, 75 of the largest Winnebago mobile homes made in the United States to Europe. The cost of the trip was $45,000 per vehicle. Or the ship line made about $3.4 million on that. And until Portsmouth Marine Terminal was closed down, Atlantic Container Line had a ship at that berth every Friday morning for 25 years. Now, does that keep on a schedule or what? Unfortunately, the only thing, I think Sarah had this next slide, but I'm going to use it. Let's have it. Next slide. Yeah. Unfortunately, the only thing that most people notice is the number of trucks hauling containers that always seem to be blocking your way in the road. To see how important international trade is here, this evening when you, ladies and